Hello, welcome. This is Steve Suffoletto at Erie Community College near Buffalo, New York. In this video, I want to take a look at some advertisements or ads that are printed in a newspaper. And the primary newspaper here will be the New York Times. Now, a lot of people don't know this, but the New York Times is printed at 26 different newspaper companies across the country, and the Buffalo News in Buffalo, New York is responsible for the regional edition of the New York Times. So this is not printed in New York City and shipped to Buffalo. This is actually printed right here in Buffalo. So the first thing I think is interesting is if we take a look at all these different samples and I fan them out, shingle them out, one of the things we notice right away is that there's all these different color papers here. I'll get a little closer here. Some are brown, some are whiter, some are gray. And that's because depending on the quality, you can order different types of papers here. But we can talk more about this in detail, but newspapers are printed on newsprint paper, which comes from groundwood pulp. Groundwood pulp means you basically take the wood and you grind it physically, mechanically, and you make the paper out of that. So the problem with groundwood pulp is that you still have the lignin, which is nature's glue or adhesive that keeps the fibers, the cellulose fibers together. For fine quality printing papers, we would typically wash that lignin out of the pulp chemically to make sure it's a fine quality paper. So lots of different colors and shades here. If I take a X-Rite 428 and I measure paper indices, we can measure the paper indices here, and we see that the paper brightness is 51. But if I measure the paper here, the paper brightness jumps up to 69. Now, not only can I measure paper brightness, but I can also measure the color of the paper. And newsprint is typically somewhere around 85 on the L star. The A will be close to 0, and the B will be like a plus, maybe like a +3, which means it's on the yellow side. So if we measure the paper here, we get an 80, a 1, and a +4. If I measure the paper here, I got a 90, 0, and +6.8. Okay. So this allows us to measure whiteness and brightness. Okay. So let's take a look at some of these samples. Not bad for a newspaper, if you think about it, right? Full, heavy, covered solids. A lot of white reverse type here. I like this one here because of all the different colors in the rainbow or the spectrum. So this is kind of like showing me my color gamut. Some famous people, Ryan Seacrest. This one's interesting because to me this almost looks like they're trying to simulate a sepia tone, and a sepia tone is a old vintage photographic look, right? Vintage sepia tone. So a lot of these advertisers are going to be high-end clothing, cosmetics, and jewelry companies. Okay, Macy's, a lot of dark shadows in here, neutral grays. Careful of the misregistration here for reverse type. Reverse registered type here. knock out, drop out, reverse out. Got to make sure you're in register. Same thing here, the reverse type. Heavy solid coverage here. Again, you're advertising to sell product, so you need to know who your demographics in your market is. Neutral gray suit, nice skin tone, flesh tones. These purple violet are difficult to print. Notice something here, or at least I see it, hopefully you see it too, that as you go from right to left, the jacket goes from blue to purple. You wouldn't want that to be the case. So if I look down here at my gray bar, I can see that we're gray here, but as we get over here, we're getting a little on the warm side, right? So these are samples that I put to the side because I thought they were interesting. I thought this was a nice skin tone, flesh tone of Dave Letterman when he retired from his the late night show. That looks pretty good. So if you haven't noticed it yet, advertisers don't want to be distracted by things that just don't seem to look good from a design point of view, from an aesthetic, cosmetic point of view. So we don't have the luxury like we do in publication or commercial printing to print color bars and then cut those off. So the technique that we use in the newspaper industry is to run this gray bar, and either visually by looking at it or numerically by measuring it, we make sure that this bar looks gray. If this bar looks gray, probably we have the proper densities and dot gains on the press sheet to make a match to the proof. Okay, now this type here, very fine serifs, so the register has to be excellent to make sure that you're still holding this open and you're not plugging up and filling this in and losing that detail. The Ralph Lauren type here is hard to read, but under microscope magnification, I actually had a screen tint in here, so I don't know why they did that. By the way, all these samples are from 2013, 14, 15, and part of 16. That's when I was working at the Buffalo News, downtown Buffalo. Okay, so you have this deep, rich black here. I don't see any detail in it at all. So a conversation we should have about something like this is, what is the tick or tack, total ink coverage or total area coverage? And in the newspaper industry, if you follow the SNAP, S-N-A-P, specifications for newsprint advertising production, I believe they recommend that their tick tack is only 220%. Color variation here. This is out of register here. Let's see if I can get you a little closer here. That's a nice looking photograph. Okay, now this image here is called a high key image, and a high key image means it's predominantly highlights, light colors and white colors, so that's called a high key photograph. This too would be a high key photograph, predominantly lights, whites, and highlights. So on both of these examples here, it's important that you know what minimum smallest dot you can hold to make sure that you can still hold this detail in here without having anything drop out or clip. We would call that a specular highlight. Okay, now this one bothers me a little bit because, again, as you go from right to left, I see the suit going from white to a pink purple. Now he's also in the shadow here. The lighting, the photographic lighting, puts him in a shadow here. So, not sure that that's correct. Again, a black here with almost no shadow detail. So we don't want to plug up and fill in. So we have to make sure we're using the proper amount of tick or tack. Or another technique we would want to use, which affects the tick and the tack,